So I wanted to tell you about these two pieces that I made. They're watercolor paintings on Stonehenge paper, and they actually have something that the others don't, which is that I use this medium on them. It's actually called 3P Artist Medium. I used a couple different types on these. I used the expanding and I used the texture. There's also a thick. And they're actually made by Pullman Polymer Products, which is created by a professor here at LSU. So we got an email earlier in the semester from the director of the art school saying that there was a chemistry professor who was interested in letting artists beta test his products that he had created. And if we were interested, we could come to the wood shop and play around with them, and if we liked what we were seeing, we could take some of the product home with us and actually just use it in our artwork. So I went and I played around with it and I thought it had a lot of potential. So I took 3 jars home, and Professor Pullman was actually nice enough to let me use his heat gun as well. So I also borrowed his heat gun, because the way this medium works is that it's infinitely moldable, pliable, it stays wet until you apply a heavy amount of heat to it. I don't actually know the specific degree requirements, but I know that a standard hair dryer won't cut it. What I actually used was a small embossing heat gun. And that, when you apply that level of heat to it, it actually starts a chemical reaction that solidifies the medium and makes it, solid. And it won't come off anymore. It's not wet anymore. And so I played around with it. I played around with how thin you can get it to be applied while still having enough mass there to have the heat reaction start. And on this one I used both the expanding as well as the texture, and on this one I just used the expanding. And so I don't know if you can tell from where you're at, but I'll zoom you in, that it's sort of, I applied it in a really, really light bas relief sort of way, so that when you get up close to it, you can kind of see that there's a texture there, but when you're a yard or two back, you feel like maybe it's just actually that I was painting that illusionistically. And then again, when you come closer, you can sort of tell if you touch it, if you get close, that there's actually medium coming out from the surface a little bit. And I think what's really nice about this is that when I applied it in really, really thin amounts, it started to crack when I had to stretch the paper back out, because obviously when you heat it, it sort of contracts on the paper and the paper seized up a little bit. And I was a little worried actually that the paper wasn't gonna unfold itself back out, because you don't want really bunchy moments. I thought that was a little too much texture for what I was going for. But actually when I was bending the paper back into shape, the medium sort of cracked in these ways that give it a real reptilian feel. And it actually took the paint surprisingly well too. Like the paint doesn't, sometimes when you use medium, the paint just kind of slips off, but in this case it didn't. And I just wanted to highlight these two separately because I thought that it was such a great opportunity. Like it was really the essence of what grad school is about, that we had the opportunity to beta test a brand new artist medium that, presumably in like 5 or 10 years is going to be sold in art stores. And instead of, being at the back end, we get to be one of the initial people who get to use it. We get to do it for free, which is always nice on a grad student's budget. And, it's just exciting. It's like one of those exciting experimental moments that I think, I'd love to have the opportunity to keep doing stuff like that. So it's also really important, I think, in terms of my overall sense of objectness of the paintings that I'm creating, because I like to use different textures in the paper themselves, but also in having, adding this texture to the paper in ways that make each individual painting different from the next. So one painting may be just a sort of a plain paper like you've seen in some of the others, one may be a heavily corrugated paper, and these may be sort of a plainer paper but with a texture on it that's really not plain at all, and that you won't see really right now anywhere else but at LSU. This one obviously is at a scale that's grander than any of the other paintings that I've made so far in this series. And I've been hesitant to paint the animals too big, because I'm afraid that if I do that, they'll actually sort of hit dinosaur level proportions and they'll feel more prehistoric, and I'm not really looking for that grandiose sort of predator feel the dinosaurs have. I'm looking more for the feel that they actually have, which is of this, small, currently quite ubiquitous, but quite possibly something that could end up not being ubiquitous in Louisiana. So I don't want them to seem like they're predators. So this is as big as I've gone, but actually I think it worked quite successfully in the scale that it's in with the paper the size that it is. I think it still reads as being an animal. It's on the threshold, I think, of turning into maybe dinosaur level, but I don't think it's there yet. Regarding these, again, I think when you get close, and I'll bring you close, you'll see that the animals themselves sort of have the scaly reptilian moment to them because of the texture, and the ridges that are created along the backs of them is really nice. The texture also actually let me use a sort of a moment of uncontrolled spontaneity, I guess, in that I didn't know how it was going to dry, and actually dries like differently depending on how the heat's going. Like the spikes will form in different areas, and so it sort of partially determined the composition. Certainly I determined where I was putting the swipes of the medium, but actually by the way in which the spikes developed and it expanded, because the expanding one expands sort of irrationally according to its own whims. You don't know what you're going to get until you get it. It actually determined where they were facing, because if it went one way, I kind of didn't have the ability to make them turn the other way. So it sort of introduced this secondary compositional decision making for me. I think that's part of the watercolors do too, because as the water runs and as gravity takes it certain ways and it pools in certain areas of the paper, I have some control over that as I twist and move the paper, but sometimes it just moves where it's going to move and it pools where it's going to pool, and you just have to embrace that. I tried to intentionally sort of work this space so you're not quite sure what the field there is behind them. Like maybe it's coming down this way. This one certainly feels like he's looking over something that's maybe falling back in space this way, but then it might twist back up. I really like that sort of lack of knowing where the space is and having it shift on you so that you feel like there's some instability in terms of where the spatial field is. I also like it when the watercolor, as it comes more out toward the edges, sometimes comes back into paper. Like you might feel like the center, there's a real sense of space, and then as you move back out, it might flatten as it reaches the edges. I think that's satisfying. I did want to highlight this painting because it's a good example of the fact that I do paint them in both intimate and, you'll see in other paintings, aggressive circumstances. And so in this painting they are actually having sex. And I think that's important to actually show, because it's a moment that leaves them sort of vulnerable to the viewer's gaze, and the viewer is sort of intruding on this moment. And it's a moment where they're, biologically providing for the next generation. So it's really symbolic of their presence on the planet right now. And then you start thinking about whether or not the next generation of these animals, if they make it, will they be able to get the same moment? Because as you can see, I've sort of washed the animals back into the ground, and the clearest points on them are actually their eyes, but where they're joined together is actually sort of fading back into the paper. So you sort of are kind of rooting for them to be able to finish what they're doing, while at the same time worrying that maybe even though you see them in this moment of ultimate fertility, maybe it's not enough. Maybe their fertility isn't enough without some sort of intervention on our part. So it sort of brings up these questions that are a lot deeper than maybe the initial moment of recognition that they're having sex brings to mind in a viewer. So initially there's like, oh look, they're having sex, that's kind of odd, and then they start really thinking about it as they look at the piece.